Thank you all for being here. My name is Dr. Leslie Braxick. I'm one of the steering committee members for the conference, and I've been looking forward to this subject ever since I read the description about it. I think one of our goals with the conference and with this whole effort is what are things that each of us can do to make a difference, and what are things that have been observed to be particularly effective or helpful. And so I think that this session is an important one for all of us, common tips for the common people. So I think that we see things where we see evidence and we read about instances where people observe and choose not to act, or where in the aftermath we'll hear that there were signs, but nobody did anything with that data and with that knowledge. And so the connection between cues and symbols and action is one that's important for all of us, and I'm sure we'll gain some wisdom and insight from our speakers today. So I will ask each of them to introduce themselves to you. They have some brief remarks I know that they want to each make, and then because of the size of the group, we won't bother with the use of the code and typing in. We're going to use an old-fashioned method of hand raising and just make this a much more interactive conversation. So as you have questions, please ask them. It's meant to be interactive. I know they want to know what your questions and ideas and thoughts are, as well as remarks that they'd like to share. So I will hand it over to you, ask for you guys to introduce yourselves, and then take it from there.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Hi, everyone. My name's Gordon Clubb. I'm a lecturer at University of Leeds, and it's a pleasure to be here. My research recently has been looking at public attitudes and public support for prevention, terrorism prevention, violent extremism prevention, and de-radicalisation programs. And my interest is in thinking, how can we generate support and to increase community buy-in into the projects?
Hi everyone, I'm Dick Donahue. I'm a policy researcher at the RAND Corporation. My primary areas of research and interest are in law enforcement research, and in supporting research across the Department of Homeland Security. I also have a kind of a personal tie to the summit and to some of the other speakers here at the summit this year. I was involved in the aftermath of the Boston Marathon bombing, very grievously injured, and obviously I'm still here today. So I do have a very strong tie to not only the research, but also to the communities that are represented here today.
And good afternoon. My name is Nick Rasmussen. I'm the head of an organization called the Global Internet Forum to Counter Terrorism, a small nonprofit organization that brings together the large technology companies that, to include social media companies, and brings them together for the purpose of generating some common collective action on the problem of online terrorism and violent extremism. And before that, I had a long career in government service, working as a national security focused professional, and eventually became director of our National Counterterrorism Center, and then pivoted to work in my post-government career to work with technology companies. Because I think, as we all understand, there's so much in that space that that is problematic in this area, and that came through loud and clear in the conversations in the plenary room this morning. So how should we go?
I think I'll just introduce broadly.
Some of your research? Or
So what I think I'll just set out very broadly, and then we could perhaps drill into it, is the different ways people can support and do support in terms of opposing violent extremism. And we can see it as a broad spectrum of starting from low commitment behaviours to more intensive physical behaviours. At the lower end, you would have in social media people calling out, tweets that are violent extremists, reporting these. This would be the lower end, and then we go up to probably the more middle area where you have bystander reporting. There's other panels on this as well. Up a little bit, you would have intimate reporting. Intimate reporting is where you have family members, loved ones. They seeing the signs of radicalization. They're usually the best people to see these signs earlier on and to help intervene. The challenge is getting them to report to the appropriate authorities. We can come back to that challenge later on. But then moving up, that scale goes up even more. In the UK, for example, we've had several notable cases where the British Muslim community have taken physical and direct action against extremists in mosques and protests and so on and so forth. So that the scope in which ordinary people, common people, can play a role is quite wide. And in my area, just the last one, I don't know where to put this, perhaps in the middle, but also with regard reintegration of violent extremists. To successfully reintegrate violent extremists, we need to help them build pro-social ties. And this is another area where communities and individuals can play an important role. That impulse to stigmatize and avoid violent extremists can be incredibly counterproductive to the goals of reintegration. And I think this is one way, a small way perhaps, that individuals, communities can play a role, that when you do have someone from a violent extremist community reintegrate, we need to help facilitate those pro-social ties. Not for any moral reasons, for practical reasons. That when they're reintegrated, when they can develop a new start in life, that is when they pose less of a risk in terms of recidivism, reoffending, re-engagement. So yeah, that for me is the broad spectrum of what people can do. But of course, imagine there might be some more we can add there, but there are serious challenges to that, which we'll talk about, I imagine. And also, there's a question of, do we really want individuals to work? To what extent are they counterproductive in some cases when they are involved in violent extremism or counter-violent extremism?
Thanks. I think you hit on some of the points that obviously parlay into some of the research that I did and I did with the team at RAND and some other folks and organizations. I was funded by the National Institute of Justice, where we looked at mass attacks and mass shootings. We compiled, unfortunately, a compilation of 600 total foiled and executed plots over the course of 5 years. We coded, analyzed these plots, and conducted some follow-on interviews and research and a lit review, engaging subject matter experts and law enforcement in the community. And we did realize that the public, common people, play an extremely important role in this. We look at over 325 cases of foiled mass attacks. Over 1/3 of those were tipped off. The primary reason why those were foiled was because of direct tips from the public. And compare that to only 9% of those cases where it was the result of a traditional criminal investigation. So the public plays, an extremely important part of that. And even in the 9%, I can assure you most of those had engagement with the public and with quote unquote common folks at some point during the course of those investigations. A few other things we looked at and got from the data were, what are the warning signs? What should people be looking for? Primarily, we found from just going through all these 600 foiled and completed mass attacks was that motivation and preparation equals warning. So intent plus action. So being inspired by past attacks, threatening and folks believing they have no choice to attack. Coupling that with things that seem simple and obvious, like having written plans for attack, trying to recruit others, seeking arsenals of weapons or ammunitions or gear without a benign reason. And one of the things we do have to weigh here is that firearms are legal in the United States. And we have to weigh some of this motivation plus preparation and weigh folks' civil liberties and what we can do under the law. We also uncovered additional indicators too that make it, I think, even more difficult. There's no easy answer for any of this, because additional indicators for these mass attacks and mass shootings are things like suicidality and domestic violence. And obviously we don't want to stigmatize folks who are suicidal. So that makes it even more difficult. And these things need to be addressed on their own, and certainly in many cases not under a law enforcement or through the criminal justice system. Other things that seem to be a bit more obvious are joining an extremist group or having a recent humiliating event and having access to weapon stockpiles. Those are additional indicators that help fuel the overall picture, what people should start to look for or notice in their community. And we've seen at these events that have been averted even recently that the folks involved had done some site probing, had done some breaching, exhibited signs of leakage where their intents and actions are starting to tip off folks. And they picked up the phone or went through an app or went on the internet and contacted the appropriate bodies, and some of these attacks were deterred. But what the next step was, and I realized this after we had really completed the project, was there's no great answer for who to call when, except when there's an imminent attack. And anyone will, any resource will say, whether it be the National Suicide Hotline or whether it be a school or an app will say, if it's an imminent threat, call 911. That's a slam dunk. But there are such a large number of ways to report, whether it be to tips.fbi.gov or downloading the See Something, Say Something app, or Safe to Talk, or now calling 988 for folks in mental health crises. That it's difficult to say, hey, this is who you should call at all times. We know that law enforcement, the mental health community, and schools, they all need to be engaged. They need to know these things. They need to be able to share this information. But I think that the best advice and recommendation that I think came out of what we all got together and talked last week was that to be able to provide some prevention framework, even the baby steps in prevention framework, is to know what's available, and to know what's available, where you live, whether it be connected to your school system, the law enforcement agencies in the area, mental health resources, and so forth.
So, in keeping with the theme of the panel, common tips for common people, and I think it's kind of unfair to kind of label you all as common, but I want to zero a little bit more into what might be actually something you observe in the online environment while some horrific act of violence is happening. And talk about how you might respond to that, because again, you are all digital natives, you have devices in your hands, you have it within your means to try to contribute to positive solutions, even while an event like that is unfolding. And I guess what I would do is probably talk a little more on the micro level rather than on the more macro prevention, or what you might call upstream level, where my colleagues were talking about trying to get in front of a horrific act of violence. I'd be talking here more about something about while something's unfolding. First of all, I think any user of social media or a technology application has an obligation or responsibility if they see ongoing violations of terms of service. Some other user engaged in hateful activity that is violative of that company's terms of service. There are reporting mechanisms, whether it's Facebook, whether it's Twitter, whether it's YouTube. There are reporting mechanisms for you to say, hey, this is unacceptable, this is not I think this is a violation of terms and service. And actually, you can do that whether you are yourself victimized or whether you see someone else being victimized. Now, it's a fair question to ask. Do those companies respond in the way that we would all want them to respond? Do they have the ability to respond as quickly and efficiently to those reports as we might like? But there are reporting mechanisms for you to engage in that. In the context of an ongoing or an unfolding attack or incident, I think it is certainly appropriate and useful for those of us who are active on social media to seek to share information that might contribute to public awareness or public safety. Hey, if you're in the neighborhood of the Madison Square Garden tonight, something terrible is happening there, be safe. Take care of yourself. Get out of there if you can, something like that. I see that as not only something that's an opportunity, but even in some ways an obligation if you have your device in your hands. At the same time, doing that without having some access to vetted information or information that you would deem reliable creates its own set of problems. And I'll come back to that in a couple minutes. I'm going to give some do's and some don'ts here. And then lastly, I'd say within the do's category, do engage in self-care when you're dealing with social media in this context. Social media can produce upsetting feelings for you if you're exposing yourself to both reports of violence or even graphic images of violence. So don't be drawn in necessarily to clicking on that link that says an attack is underway, because you might see something that you might find hard to unsee. So I would just urge that you engage in some degree of preemptive self-care when you're consuming what you consume on the internet. And you can still be a good citizen, sharing awareness onward, without necessarily having to expose yourself to some of the horrific things that you might see with graphic images and whatnot. So those would fall into the kind of the do's category. In the don'ts category, don't spread information or push information further around the ecosystem unless you yourself have some way of validating or determining that it's coming from a reliable source. Again, to use my example earlier, if there might be an attack underway at the Madison Square Garden, obviously if there's an NYPD tweet, that's a reliable source. Or the FBI Joint Terrorism Task Force operating in New York City, that would be a reliable source of information. But you just pushing on something you've heard or adding several thousand or dozens of thousands of more followers based on rumors or rumored information that you became aware of isn't actually helping with situational awareness, isn't actually helping keep people safe. So again, it's so easy to hit that retweet button or to share onward to your group of followers or friends in a Facebook or a Twitter setting, but do so with a little bit of discrimination and care before you push information onward, because you just may be contributing to the problem rather than the solution. I'd also say don't, in most cases, look to share information about perpetrators or those responsible for attacks. One, again, as these issues are unfolding, it's often unclear who perpetrators are, and as we've seen, entire communities can be stigmatized. Individuals can have their lives ruined if they are identified as a perpetrator or as a member of a community carrying out an attack against another community. So again, take that extra step to rely on vetted sources of information, whether it's from local law enforcement, state and local government, other sources that you yourself trust. It could even be local media here in the Pittsburgh area if you believe those are sound sources at all. But it's important that the information that you push onward to the maximum extent possible be authoritative, or else, as I said, you're just contributing to even more chaos and churn. Similarly, in terms of pushing other material onward with your retweeting functions or your sharing functions, if those images are potentially disturbing to you, you can assume that they are potentially disturbing or harmful or painful for someone else as well. And so again, you can share information about some attack or some incident going on without having to share those graphic images in a way that might create harm to someone that you might not even know. And then lastly, I would say don't elevate or draw attention to the thinking or writings or utterances of the actual perpetrators. You will often see in the aftermath of horrific events, individuals post on Twitter, hey, I found this guy's manifesto sitting on Facebook, or I found it sitting in Google Docs somewhere. And all of a sudden now I'm going to put that on my social, I'm going to post it. I'm posting it for the right reasons. I think this is a way to share awareness, but all I'm really doing is amplifying and elevating this individual and putting and spreading that individual's material further and further across the surface area of the internet. So again, I would just make a simple request as you think about how to respond to these horrific events, and particularly when these events have an online dimension, is be careful, be thoughtful, and try to think for yourself what is actually contributing to public awareness, understanding, information, and public safety, and what might actually do unintended harm to my own community. Why don't I stop there and look forward to further conversation.
Cool. Hey, everybody. Hi. Everybody, my name is Wasim Mohammed. I'm the worst moderator you'll ever meet. Sorry for being late. I unfortunately had a family emergency and just was able to come. But you guys are doing great. You don't even need me. So I appreciate it. I think I understand where we started. Just the question on what can people do, and I heard the responses that very much appreciated. There's an aspect of it I wanted to focus on. I think right now in these times, especially throughout the conference, we're talking a lot about radicalization and how that happens, right? And how there's new tools for that. There's venues and avenues for that. And I was wondering, to me, especially, for a long time, I always saw it as a systems issue, right? Or like a school needs to deal with that, or a government needs to deal with that, or something, right? My question to you all is that in that pathway to radicalization, or the pathway to de-radicalization, right, or trying to decrease the amount of rhetoric, like you said, that's online or in person, that's kind of leading to people like these manifestos getting shared and people being inspired by it. How do we, is there a role for the individual to play, right? I'm going to add nonprofits into that, like private, not non-government entities, right, or collections of people that are in an organization or a group. Is there a role, for them to play, or is this a government responsibility and we don't have to do anything in particular as individuals? So whoever would like to start. Yeah.
So what I think that if we just take individuals, I mean, there is a role, but it has to be a role, an individual role has to be in conjunction and led by either government organisations or non-profit organisations. And the reason I say this is that, I mean, you were referring to the referral processes. In the UK, we have a very clear referral process. If you suspect radicalisation, we're talking upstream, as you mentioned. If you suspect radicalisation, there are people you can call. There's a lot of information there. The problem is that the public are very poor at understanding signs of radicalisation. And look, I'll probably include myself in that as well, right? I'm not criticising people. I think it's just a key problem in how we conceptualise and understand radicalisation, that many of the measures of radicalisation are broad. This is something for experts to judge. And usually they look at the radicalisation factors in conjunction with other factors, right? So individuals are disadvantaged. And that has serious consequences insofar as many of the referrals in the UK system are non-referrals. They get passed right back out the system, undermines trust within the referral system because it's seen as targeting Muslims. There are several stories of children being referred to Prevent because the teacher thought that they wrote cooker bomb. They didn't. They wrote cucumber. And they were reported to that. It's much more complicated than that, but by and large it captures the fundamental problem in this grassroots approach, okay? So what you see here is a more of an effort to educate and interact and communicate with individuals to improve that referral process, to help identify those who are at risk of radicalisation upstream. And for me, a big part of that is programs being transparent in what they do. Because there are some people who will be happy to refer and report people if they suspect radicalisation. You don't want them, they're going to do that anyway. You want the people who are not sure they're going to report someone. They are part of the radical milieu. That's the audience that you're trying to convince. And that's what the work we need to do. That's why NGOs need that extra work. How do you convince that radical milieu to report their loved one who they suspect is about to engage in terrorism, right? So how do we do that? And for me, I think one of the ways is we need to be transparent with our processes, transparent with the referral process. If you report a loved one, they're going to get support, right? It's a supportive mechanism. So that's why it's important that we're transparent with what that referral process is. And I can go on more what that transparency looks like because it's a double-edged sword. But for me, that is important. We need to be able to communicate that. And that's how we bring in individuals. But it has to be led by experts.
That's really important. I think, thank you, Gordon, that's perfect. Now, I was really, really interested to see, like, as somebody sitting here or somebody's watching at home, and they're like, oh, well, I understand how my either implicit bias or lack of understanding of what radicalization really looks like would prevent me from feeling confident either in referring somebody properly, the right person, or it would prevent me from even referring at all, right? Is there currently a resource for people to better educate themselves on what are the actual signs of radicalization, or is that just a process thing that needs to be fixed for the funnel to be able to weed people out more easily, right? Like, so I want to know more. How can I do that? Is the simple question. Yeah.
Let me jump in on that because again, when I was in government service, one of the things we were trying to do at a national level was try to create kind of simple, understandable, explanatory products, intelligence products that could be generated at the national level, where we had a lot of the research and information about radicalization, both in the overseas environment, but also here inside the United States, and put that material in a package, in a form where it could be shared with local law enforcement, local government at the state, tribal, and local level in the United States, so that a policeman, a police officer operating here in Pittsburgh would know what signs of radicalization look like, just in the way you asked the question. That's a partial solution. It's not an entire solution, because it's not pushing the information further and deeper into society, further and deeper into families, further and deeper into communities, so that individuals could feel confident in the way that you just described. Mm-hmm. Now, I'd like to think that we could, put all of this responsibility at the feet of the federal government, but I don't think that's fair or reasonable or likely to give us the solutions that we want. In fact, when I think about most of the prevention work we're talking about now, the words that most often come to mind for me are whole of society rather than whole of government. It has to involve all aspects of society. And I also think of it in a multidisciplinary way. In some cases, when an individual who's at risk of radicalization is identified, then there might be a solution that leans into the educational resources that a community has to offer. Help this person get into a set of educational activities that will redirect them from that path that they're on. In other cases, it might be something in the public mental health sphere that you could redirect that person into. And unfortunately, that sounds a lot to me like casework.
It does.
And casework, as you know, is labor intensive. It means a community focusing in on the individual, unpacking what his or her actual challenges and life circumstances are, and then tailoring a set of solutions to get that person to a better place. That's hard.
Yeah. Nick, that's also what we got to in our research too. It was building up a whole of community threat assessment framework. But obviously the tips need to start on the left side somewhere, even further left, and come in and then be assessed by schools, mental health, law enforcement, and it needs to be things need to be shared, rights need to be protected, and it's a difficult and it is labor intensive framework that it's. I don't think it's any other word than just difficult. But
not every community has the same level of resources across the country. Not every community will have the same degree of investment in public mental health or education or
trust in law enforcement is another major issue.
So it unfortunately leaves us with a reality that there'll be somewhat of a patchwork across the United States, as you think this is where our federal system works against us in some ways.
It's interesting in the sense that, because I didn't know, I thought there would be something developed here, because in the UK we have, I'm not saying they're perfect, but we have Prevent Release published 2 websites, don't know why they did 2, 2 websites, which detail signs of radicalisation to help loved ones identify the cause for concern. They do several things like bringing case studies. They have really good infographics. Infographics are pretty good at building up that willingness to refer intimates. They have this reassurance, I think, that the experts will engage with this and that will be a supportive process. So this could be a resource that is used. But here, I mean, that sounds great, doesn't it? That let's get a website and we can get communities to work with that. This is where the double-edged sword comes in. We did research on that website to see if that increased trust and if that increased willingness to refer a loved one. That website, which gives information, did the opposite. And this is what I said about the double-edged sword about transparency. It made you less likely to trust the prevention program. It made you less likely to refer a loved one. What we did was we switched the narrative. We told them what would happen if they referred a loved one. What was the process? Why was that the decision made? It increased trust and support. It made them more willing to report intimates. And this was the same among a radical milieu as well, right-wing radical milieu. So there are ways for us to increase that support as well. There's ways for us to communicate the signs of radicalisation to the public, to the community, to enable them to take action. Because I think that's what the important point of the whole society's approach is, to empower them to be able to play a role, and a productive role as well.
And some of my colleagues that I've worked with in federal law enforcement very often feel like, when I get the referral at the FBI or in the police department, what am I supposed to do with that? I don't want to throw a 15-year-old kid who's in a vulnerable place in jail. I don't want to try to prosecute and lock this person up, but I've got to be able to have some handoff capacity to some supporting community element. And that's a pretty vague term I just made, supporting community element, but who will take responsibility for that and take it off the hands of police or law enforcement so that they can be confident that that referral is being managed, as I said, in a casework kind of way, but that the security risk to the community is still being managed and being attended to. Again, a police can't turn away in cases like that and say, not going to prosecute him, so I'm not going to worry about it. But at the same time, the police and the FBI often don't want to be the first responder or the line of first resort in managing those referrals. And to Gordon's point, if the police are the first line of referral, people won't refer because, again, they don't want their loved ones to go to jail. They want their loved ones to get help.
Yeah, no, thank you. That's really...
We had a question out there, actually.
Hi, go ahead.
So I guess the question is, I'm a school superintendent, and we get these types of tips, and I'm right here in Pittsburgh. We don't even have a crisis team because they can't staff it, right? So we often call and say, child says he's bringing a gun or is going to blow up, church on Sunday. They tell us to call 911. So what's happened, thinking about this school prison pipeline, right, that we're trying to all avoid, that's the only thing kind of in our tool bag to address these types of reports that I'm in a school district right here, 1,200 kids. We've already had 4 guns this school year.
Wow.
So that's in less than 30 days of 1,200 in a K-12 system. So I'm just kind of wondering, what should the system look like? What does utopia look like? And then how do we get there as in our space? What are the next steps so that we can build a better tomorrow?
Yeah, thank you. Glad I'm the moderator. Go ahead. Yeah.
Just before is there anyone else in the UK? Because, no? Okay, because if you're from the UK, you probably shout saying I'm talking rubbish. But, okay, so I think this, in UK case, what we have is it doesn't get dealt with the police per se. And it's not necessarily, the first protocol isn't a criminal case. It's looked at beforehand through the channel process to see if there is some way that they can support that individual. Sometimes their support with mental health. And so that isn't taken for a criminal matter. The police are obviously involved in case it escalates, but there's social workers involved in that early prevention space, which enables teachers like yourself to, if you have concerns, you report that, and then they take care of that. And now that may be a model that is useful. Now the reason why I was double checking there's UK people in the audience, Prevent is highly controversial in the UK. So there are ways of us managing that. I mean, I'm a big fan of prevention. I think it's important. I don't think kids should be criminalised. I think we should be trying to find ways to support them at that early stage there. So I think there's something to look at that. It's whether the mechanisms with that, but the broad picture, I think that having those kind of mechanisms for teachers to report concerns and those concerns to be dealt with earlier than the police stage. I think that would be what I would think is quite an important one. We have that across Europe as well.
For us, we looked at larger events in mass attacks, so not necessarily community levels of violence. I mean, there are tools, toolkits, proven, tested strategies that can work for community violence prevention involving and not involving law enforcement. But obviously, this can be highly dependent on where you live, what the funding is like, what the staffing is like, what the community level support is like for all of this. And again, it's there's no one cookie cutter. When I talked earlier about just knowing who to call and come back to criminal justice research in America, there's 18,000 law enforcement agencies. There's a lot more than you guys have. 18,000. So that makes it even more difficult for in terms of who to contact, the abilities of those folks to do a good job and carry on a full investigation. And again, it's just really knowing what is available in your local areas and pushing forward if need be.
Let me just answer the question of what I think utopia looks like. Because I think what utopia looks like, and again, we're a long way from being able to achieve it, is at each level of government, say it's a city, a town, a state, there is a virtual or literal table, conference table, where the right people, guided by a coordinator, a prevention coordinator, gets together to, as I mentioned a bit earlier, literally work case by case through every individual who might potentially be of concern. And that table is surrounded by representatives that we could bring to that table all of the different resources that a community has to offer, whether those are educational, employment related, public health related. And literally, as each file is looked at, someone around the table can say, that young person is struggling because of a difficult home situation. I can bring something to the table that helps ameliorate that part of the problem. I can help get that person a job. That might help give them something to grab onto that might prove to be a diversionary pathway. That's hard, labor intensive, and again, we aren't resourced to do that at every level around the country. But I have seen that kind of casework model be effective in communities around the country. A colleague of mine very much plays this role in the Denver, Colorado community, where she sits and works out of the U.S. Attorney's office for that part of Colorado. She is the convener for that kind of conversation that I just described. Again, though, to do that at a level around the country, at every down to the level of a 1,200 student school district here in Pittsburgh, we're not resourced at that level to do that. But these are not things that are solved from Washington with large federal programs. I think we can all agree on that.
Go ahead, please. Was that okay? I have a follow-up in a second, but I would love you to go first. Go ahead.
I was just in another session called the Strong Cities Network, and I'm just wondering how the panel feels about the fact that there might be, you're never going to be able to do something 100% perfect, but we've got to start somewhere. And it feels like there might be a mechanism there that we could take some existing models, the toolkits that exist, the models that exist, and try to create that awareness and education through the Strong Cities Network, and then allow them to plug and play and create the toolkit that's going to work for their place. Because you're right, it's going to come down to the local level, right, and what resources they have. But it might be a way to get it started, because, you got to put it out there somehow.
Well, and what you described is obviously makes sense, because you don't want each community to have to invent or learn this difficult stuff all on their own the first time they're confronted with it. There are communities that have been grappling with different forms of extremism for a long period of time. So there are models, there are data-driven models that can allow communities to kind of go to school on what other communities have done. And so I think you're 100% right on kind of drawing on the lessons learned from communities that have been successful in this regard.
Yeah, and in terms of following up on leads and information and what have you, the threat assessment model, I had to put a piece of paper in front of me to remind me how many different partners and people feed into that. Everybody from intelligence centers, public safety, law enforcement, courts, schools, mental health, social services, religious centers, social media companies, critical infrastructure, private sector, public sector. It's really having these touch points and interactions and partnerships and trust is important for this, and a wealth of other issues as well.
There's always that risk with prevention work. I think the way you put it, I was like, yeah, that's utopia. That's great. Yeah, I appreciate I'm not aware I'm becoming aware of how big America is, how complex America is, right? So it's really difficult. The solutions are going to be unique to America as well. But coming back to my point in terms of the risk with prevention is that, for example, if in the cities, then you're getting a certain type of extremism and you're ignoring, or not ignoring, but you're not addressing another type of extremism, which is typically right-wing extremism, which is outside the cities. And so, yeah, there's always these problems and pitfalls that come when you work in prevention area. And I mean, yeah, in smaller places like the UK, that's easier because you can take it at that national level. But in a country as complex as America, yeah, that's fascinating. That's a fascinating but a challenging problem to deliver prevention, given all those risks that prevention can pose.
Yeah. And I think that, one of the things that prevention work has suffered from over the past 2 decades here in the United States is that it's sometimes been perceived by some communities as being a tool to stigmatize those communities. So we hear from the government to come to talk to you about radicalization in your community. Well, that starts the whole conversation off in a bad place.
Yeah.
Instead of saying, wait a minute, we're coming at this from a public health approach. We want to keep healthy, strong, safe communities. How do we all work together to get to that outcome? Too often, I think, over the early parts of the post 9/11 period, the conversation was about how do we look at your community to make sure there aren't bad people in your community? And that, again, that's a terrible place to start the conversation, because then you never get the buy-in that you need from that community. And I think those are the hard lessons learned from the last 20 years.
Yeah, no, I mean, breaking community trust, I used to run the Islamic Center of Pittsburgh, and after, the tragedy of Tree of Life, we, naturally, a lot of community members wanted to hear from federal officials, right? FBI, DOJ, people came, we had a meeting with a bunch of community members. They wanted to do a presentation. They did the presentation. Presentation was on how to spot radicalization in your own community. It couldn't have been the worst possible time to say that. We all want to know, how do we make sure we're safe? We get threats. A lot of times we're dismissive of the threats because nothing had ever happened before. Now something happens down the street. All the threats seem much more real. We want somebody to talk to us about that, right? And how do you immediately destroy trust? Anything that we've built over several years of attempting to try to build a relationship is that kind of gesture. So I appreciate that, trust and transparency being core. One thing I wanted to ask, because the school thing is very interesting because it led to the conversation of community violence, I think is the term you said that describes it. Do you see a difference between community violence, say, call it a school shooting, or local community shooting, or obviously it's the U.S., we have a lot of mass shootings, a lot of issues here, versus hate-related violence, right? Is there a difference in your mind in terms of what those things are and how we approach it? Do you feel the approaches are similar, or what are the distinctions? I'm curious if you see them differently, or do you see them very similarly?
I mean, I see them differently. I mean, there's going to be some overlaps, but intimate partner violence or domestic violence, where somebody's killed, is certainly different than a mass shooting or extremism. Yeah. Shootings over gang violence or drug violence. Those are clearly different than extremism or hate motivated crimes or killings. So there are some places, but then again, you see some of the indicators can tend to be some of the same. So there's a bit of an overlap, but in my opinion, there are certainly some places where you can make a clear and convincing line or argument that they are two distinct bins.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
I mean, I think there's always, in the aftermath of one of these horrific events, there's always that immediate question, why? Mm-hmm. What was going through that person's brain that made them think that was a reasonable response, or that the community that they attacked was somehow not deserving of fundamental human protections? And so I don't know that, again, binning these into, and then there are some of these horrific acts of violence for which there is never an explanation. It literally turns out there's nothing in that person's profile, their background, their social media history. The cops look through their computers and find nothing. There's no manifesto. It's just it literally becomes unexplainable, inexplicable about why that individual carried out that act of violence. And yet there's still, I mean, the research that Dick's talking about here is still so important, is because if you stop there, you would just throw up your hands and say there's nothing we can do about it. Instead, what you can do is try to rely on data and say there are some indicators, and those indicators sometimes suggest themselves early enough in the process where a community can do something about it, and again, ideally without the law involved. That is, speaking of utopia, that's the utopia place you want to be. Not that you've locked up the kids in your community, but that you've intervened pre any of those things. The FBI director, Director Wray, says by the time he's involved, it's too late. There's usually something that has to be prosecuted, and he doesn't want to be there, and of course, no community wants to be there. So that's what I would say, is you may not be able to explain every one of those shootings in that, or attacks in those ways, but there's still enough we can draw from the kind of research that RAND is doing about indicators that is actionable and that we can act on.
Do you see the infrastructure to respond to community violence and the infrastructure to respond to hate violence, and radicalization and people on that path, as we've been talking about the whole time, like that infrastructure? How connected could it be? Just for because that's an entire community of advocates, right, in the United States, right? There's a lot of people pushing for that funding, especially in cities. We're talking about sister cities and partner cities and stuff. A lot of funds, is there a way to kind of integrate that in a way? And that's a systems question. I'm gonna move back to individuals because I know I like to get into. Well,
I'm gonna point to some of the comments that one of our colleagues this morning made when we were doing one of those speed round things at the front podium this morning. A woman named Brett Steele, who was my colleague at the McCain Institute in Washington, D.C. She talked about some work she's doing there to build what she calls a practitioners network. And she mentioned up to 875 people right now who are part of this practitioners network. That means 875 people have identified themselves as having some role to play in the kind of prevention work we've talked about. Maybe they're an expert on incels. Maybe they're a mental health professional who's in big cities and has seen that extremism get to kids in their communities. That network at least is a starting point for someone when they encounter it. They can at least look around and say, okay, is anybody in this 875 person network able to help me? That's a start. And I know she would love it if that network was double or triple that size, so that you could find some school superintendent of a similarly sized school district and say, help, and there'd be someone in that network who's confronted exactly what you're confronting. So that's the systems approach that I think I'd like to see. But it's very grassroots oriented, and it seems kind of basic, blocking and tackling in some ways.
Yeah, perfect. And I think we're about done, so I just wanted to have like a last word, for folks, just to suggest one takeaway as an individual action or any recommendations of how to commit themselves more into anti-hate work, either as a profession or as an individual volunteer. Yeah.
Everyone's looking at me. I have to go.
You can go this direction. That works.
Can we go?
I guess I would just maybe start where I kind of ended there, or end where I started, which was, in a way, this all has to happen at a community level, because it's impossible to do this kind of work in any way that isn't individual to individual. And so I think if communities are looking to Washington to solve problems in this area, it will be a long and difficult wait.
Yeah. Thank you. Dave?
And I think I also have to come back to something I said earlier, that the public is extremely important. Everyone's extremely important in reporting and responding and making sure these things can be stopped well ahead of time. And my recommendation to follow on there is just know what tools and be comfortable with what tools are out there and are specific to your profession and or the area you live in.
If the only solution is through communities, and there's certainly benefits working with a community approach that's not a government approach, there's a lot of potential in that, in the sense that you don't have the baggage that comes with the government being involved in that. So I think there's a lot of potential in that approach, and I think it is important that is led by expertise. There is that dialogue to ensure that there's consistency and the sharing of experiences, and there's that interaction with communities there, that communication, as I said, that transparency, or that good type of transparency. I think that has to be an integral part of any work to bring in communities.
Perfect. Well, thank you all so much for your time. I appreciate it. Thank you.